can you do a Brussels fudge on this one? European Union summits are renowned for the ingenious ways devised to blur the lines and horse trade on hot-button issues. Those late-night compromises are what keep the 27 together at the bargaining table till next time. This time, it seems fairly binary. Either Poland stops defying the prerogatives of the European Court of Justice and respects protection of basic rights for all, or Brussels sits on nearly 24 billion euros of pandemic recovery funds that Warsaw is counting on. We'll ask if that's legal, and we'll ask if that's the right thing to do, particularly amid growing calls to call out Hungary, Slovenia, and others. Germany's European Affairs Minister, a social democrat, doesn't see where you can compromise on this one. Michael Roth calls this a fight for Europe's identity. However, he's not the one who calls the shots in Berlin. Until the leader of Roth's SPD manages in the weeks or months ahead to cobble together a new coalition government, Angela Merkel's still in charge of the outgoing coalition. And the Christian Democrat chancellor still insists that she favors dialogue over confrontation with her Central European neighbors. Is Merkel right? How strongly do other European powers feel? And will the standoff with Poland affect the future direction of the EU? Will it be decided, by the way, in Brussels or Berlin? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what has been called a battle for Europe's values. And joining us, France's former European Affairs Minister, Nathalie Loiseau, today member of the European Parliament with Emmanuel Macron's Renew Europe. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening.
Thanks as well for joining us from Strasbourg, fellow MEP Daniel Freund of the German Green Party. Welcome back to the show.
Nice to be here.
From Brussels, Dominika Kozic, correspondent for Polish state broadcaster TVP. Nice to see you.
Good evening.
And with us as well, Famke Krummüller, executive director of the risk consultancy Geostrategic Business Group with EY France. EY is in Ernst & Young.
That's right.
Okay, thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Poland's prime minister going into that European Council summit, guns a-blazing. Mateusz Morawiecki hammering home the same point he made earlier in the week at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Poland's constitutional court is correct, he says. National courts should keep final say over the European Court of Justice. And to an EU where, he said, quote, more and more frequently decisions are made behind closed doors by European judges.
We will not act under the pressure of blackmail. We are ready for dialogue, and we do not agree with constantly expanding the scope of competence. But we will, of course, discuss how to solve current disputes in agreement and in dialogue.
Nathalie Loiseau, he employed for the second time this week the term blackmail. Your reaction?
There is nothing as like blackmail in what we are standing for. We are standing for the rights of all Europeans, including Polish citizens. This notion of European law, it's a notion of protecting rights. And now it's been taking place for quite some time, but now the Polish judiciary has turned into a political body which goes against commitments that were freely made by Poland when they joined the European Union.
Isn't all judiciary a political body? I mean, in France, we have a constitutional council. They're human beings, so therefore that's political too.
Well, we are all human beings, but there is a clear separation of powers. And when you start saying, if you're a government or a parliament, that you abide by the law when you like it, and you don't abide by the law when you don't like it, or you dismiss judges when you disagree with them, it's the beginning of autocracy. So it's a danger for democracy. And this is not the reason why Poland joined the European Union. We all have vivid memories of Solidarność demonstrations on a country who wanted to turn it back from oppression and from this sort of confusion of powers.
Dominika Kozic, your reaction?
I don't agree completely with Madame Loiseau, Minister Loiseau, because in Poland, Polish Constitutional Court didn't say that we will not respect the decision of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg. The only one verdict of Polish Constitutional Tribunal was that Poland will respect the verdict of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which are according to the treaties. Because when you look on the EU treaties, not all part of the life or not all the part of the political life are in the hands of EU institutions. For example, a very controversial question like abortion, it is in decision to the government, to member states, not to the European Commission or Parliament. So if it will be some verdict of the Constitutional of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, which will be just giving more power to this institution and than to the Polish government will be strict and will keep the EU treaties, and then Polish constitution will be above. But it doesn't mean that Poland will not respect the verdict of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg.
Daniel Freund, how do you understand it? What are the prerogatives for the European Court of Justice? What are the prerogatives for national courts?
Well, when a member state joins the Union, they join a body of law, treaties and the laws that derive from those treaties. And obviously that law is then enforced by the national courts, but under the supervision of the European courts, because we need to make sure that those European laws are interpreted the same way, whether in Poland, in Germany and Portugal or elsewhere. And if now the Polish courts are no longer independent, if there is political influence, if judges are dismissed because of their rulings through an illegitimate disciplinary chamber that the EU court has said is illegitimate, and if that court ruling is ignored, and then they say, well, we don't think that the EU court should have that kind of oversight, and then they stop applying the EU law, then Poland is de facto leaving the legal order of the European Union. And that is, of course, something that Poland is free to decide. But then we can no longer give any EU money to Poland, because we can no longer be sure that Poland abides by the EU rules to spend that money on what this money is foreseen for.
And what do you answer to those who say, well, that's Brussels playing God with Poland's domestic affairs?
No, it's not. But that is the very basic deal that every country has gone into when they joined the European Union. We have common rules and we spend money together. If you don't abide by those rules, you cannot spend the money together. That's as simple as it is. It's not playing God, but that's the basic deal of this union.
All right, so we had earlier that scene in the European Parliament. Daniel, you were there, and so were you, Nathalie Loiseau, where you had the Polish Prime Minister stating his case. He talked about blackmail. And you also had the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She made it clear that if the Poles don't bend, the first stop, ironically enough, will be the European Court of Justice.
Honourable members, we cannot and we will not allow our common values to be put at risk. The Commission will act, and the options are all known. First option, infringements, where we legally challenge the judgment of the Polish Constitutional Court. Another option is the conditionality mechanism and other financial tools. The Polish government has to explain to us how it intends to protect European money given this ruling of their constitutional court.
That's an interesting point. The Polish government has to explain to us, Famke Grommüller, how it intends to protect European money, given the ruling.
I mean, I think it leads back to a challenge that the EU has had often and on multiple fronts. It is a union of member states, and they're trying to work together and their national interests and European interests. And I think what we're seeing here is that the crisis, the COVID pandemic has reinforced, I think, in several member states, the force towards more a discourse that's more oriented towards national interests and towards a national audience. And I think that's what's happening here as well.
More towards national interests and a national audience. Dominika Kozic, do you take Daniel Freund's point that, if you want to play with those, if you want to put the focus on those national interests, well, then there are strings attached if you want European money?
I think that all EU members is defending their own, yes, and representing their own national interest. Even if some of the governments says that they are representing European interest, in fact, it is always the interest of these member states. But I will go back to this conditionality because previously it was using only this conditionality to protect the budget, EU budget. It means that it should be it should be avoided situation like corruption, like lack transparency in spending of EU money. And it was initial point of the European Commission. I remember what told 3 years ago, Commissioner Oettinger, who was then responsible for the budget issues in the Commission, he told that this new mechanism will protect EU money because the Commission wants to be sure that it will be transparency and it will be fight with the corruption. And it is not the case of Poland and Polish democracy, etc. It is more case of countries like Bulgaria or Romania who has problem with corruption. It was initial point of the European Commission, and it was idea to create this new mechanism, and not the rule of law which is now describing by the European Parliament or previously by the German presidency. It has changed last year, that's true, during the EU summit in July under the pressure of the European Parliament. The German presidency has made other definition of rule of law and other definition of this mechanism, but initially it was concerned only to protect EU money from the corruption and the lack of transparency.
So, Daniel Freund, is that what happened? Did the definition of rule of law change?
No, the definition has never changed all along. This mechanism has been called the rule of law conditionality from the start. And there has always been, since the very early draft in the Commission, there has been a list. And indeed, it includes things like transparency and anti-corruption, but it very clearly also lists the independence of the judiciary. Because if we don't have independent judges that enforce the rules, obviously there is a risk for the EU budget as well. Because if there is a fraud case, if there's any kind of dispute in a project funded with EU money in Poland, and you cannot rely on Polish judges protecting the EU financial interest, well, then EU money is at stake and in risk. And that is why the rule of law conditionality very much applies to the Polish case as well, if independence of the judiciary no longer functions in Poland.
Nathalie Loiseau, when you were European Affairs Minister, there was this story that broke about Viktor Orban's family and friends benefiting from EU money. Is the mistake that there wasn't a harsher response then?
You know, when I was in government, indeed, we were already discussing in the General Affairs Council the question of rule of law in Poland and in Hungary. So that is not new. What has just changed is the interpretation that the Constitutional Tribunal in Warsaw does about the treaties, and the fact that they don't even accept the first article of the treaty is really something which is appalling. The first article of the treaty is about being a European Union, and Poland has lived for 17 years within this European Union without having said anything about shared values, fundamental values, rule of law. And now, all of a sudden, now that this Constitutional Tribunal has changed, has been politicized, all of a sudden, Poland, or more accurately, not Poland, the Polish government has problems with the commitment it made. But you're right to remind people that we have been discussing the rule of law in Poland for years, trying to trigger Article 7. And then there was this...
Remind us what Article 7 is.
Is that if the European Union considers that there is a serious risk of a member state breaching the rule of law, it should be deprived of its voting rights in the European Union. Why didn't it go further so far? Because Hungary and Poland go hand in hand and support each other. It's no surprise that these are two member states where there are currently governments more and more leaning towards authoritarianism, which are allies in this story. Other member states don't say the same thing.
Famke Krummüller, we're back to talking about the unanimity rule.
Right, that's right. And I think the broader problem that comes with this is that it creates uncertainty, right? It questions the legal order of the European Union, and it really creates legal and political uncertainty to a certain extent. And I think the other challenge that comes with this is that it could potentially open further doors to new debates. I think we've seen this, that in other countries, certain politicians have seized the opportunity, let's say, to jump on that Polish ruling and create further uncertainty. I think this is really an additional challenge.
Not just in other countries, by the way. Nathalie Loiseau, we've seen candidates, I don't know if you know, but there's a presidential election coming up here in a few months' time. And we've seen candidates, including the EU's former Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, who says when it comes to immigration, French law should have the prerogative over European law.
I completely disagree with Michel Barnier, and I have to say I'm very disappointed by this statement of his, because law is not a question of pick and choose. If you abide by the law only for things that you approve and not for things that you disapprove, there is no legal order anymore. Imagine that a criminal in the street would say, well, there are things that I like in national law and others that I dislike, so I don't respect them. This is not possible. What is a European law? This is something that is decided democratically through members of the European Council, so heads of states and governments and ministers who come from democratic elections, and members of the European Parliament who come from democratic elections as well. So this is something we decide in common.
All right. Poles themselves surprised that what started out as a domestic, if you will, culture war over issues like Dominika was mentioning it, abortion, but there's also gay rights, independence of the judiciary, as we've been talking about, freedom of the press, has now spilled over and become the dominant topic at this EU summit. Shirley Sitbon has more.
Many Poles say their country should make itself heard in the EU. Residents are divided over the Polish Constitutional Court's decision last week that says national law trumps EU law, except in specific circumstances.
Our European Union membership should be based on the principle that Poland has its own autonomy and its own voice.
The EU has tried to block what it sees as Poland's attempt to dismantle its justice system by replacing judges with others who back the ruling party. But the Polish government says the bloc is meddling with its legitimate reforms. There has been talk of Poland quitting the EU, copying the UK with a so-called Polexit. The government, though, denies having such intentions, to the relief of local residents.
I think that Poland as a country isn't strong enough to manage without the support of the European Union.
I think that the media has tried to sell us a political game on both sides of the Polish political divide. But this game has nothing in common with reality, because the government is actually very much in compliance with EU policies.
Those who are concerned by the government's reforms hope EU leaders will force Poland to get back in line with its democratic standards.
Dominika Kozic, you heard some of those people interviewed on the street there in Gdansk and in Warsaw. Your thoughts on the fact that you have right now a very polarized political situation in Poland between the ruling Law and Justice Party, the opposition Civic Alliance, and Civic Platform, and now how it's spilled over into Europe?
I would like just to go back to one thing, because we are talking sometimes about the situation of LGBT and like this. And in Poland, I would like to just tell you that in Poland, the Polish judicial system, nothing didn't change according to the situation of the LGBT. It is only discussion, and it is only about rhetoric and political language. It is not about the decision of the court in this case. And I would like also to to remember that Donald Tusk, who was Prime Minister of Poland by 8 years, he didn't do anything for the people from the society of LGBT. It is still the same politics in Poland towards these issues, like it was under the Donald Tusk as a head of the Polish
But you agree,
government.
Dominika, that the heart of the matter here...
It is only...
Dominika, you agree that the heart of the matter here is this issue of rule of law and the constitutional court, which is appointed directly by Parliament, saying it overrides what the ECJ does.
I would like to mention one thing, because we are talking about the sentence of the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland about Polish constitution, etc. Do you know that the former Constitutional Tribunal of during the government of Platform Civic had told the same, exactly the same. It was in 2005, and then in 2010, it was the same sentence of the Constitutional Tribunal that Polish constitution is more important than EU treaties, than EU law. Of course, when it is agreed to the EU treaties. So, I mean that if some decisions are not provided by EU treaties and they are in the hands of the governments, it is Polish constitution who is above. And it was decision of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal in 2005 and then in 2010. So it means that this decision of the sentence of the Constitutional Tribunal now under the government of law and justice is nothing new. It is still the same line of the Polish...
Nathalie Loiseau, you hear Dominika saying, we have a winner-takes-all kind of system in Poland a little bit. So what? And sometimes it's Donald Tusk's party, sometimes it's Law and Justice that's in power.
I don't disagree with one thing, is that in each and every single member state, the Constitution is the most prominent legal text. It's true everywhere in the European Union. But when provisions of the Constitution are not aligned with the evolution of European law in each and every member state, we change the Constitution because we sovereignly decided that we would abide by European law. So nobody is saying that a constitution is not the most prominent legal text. But when now, and it is new, the Constitutional Tribunal of Poland says, well, we won't respect European law when we consider that we don't have to. This is something different, and this is something that should not happen, and it's something that the Polish government and Polish people should fix, and the faster the better, because it's not leaving the European Union, but it is leaving the European legal order. And Poland cannot have its cake and eat it, cannot deny the importance of the European law and still want to benefit from European money. There is a choice to make. It's a sovereign choice, but it has to be made.
Nathalie Loiseau, they're echoing the words that we heard from her successor as French European Affairs Minister. And we heard at the outset of this summit very strong language from the likes of the Dutch Prime Minister, the leader of Ireland, the leader of Belgium. What is interesting is to hear from those who are more, shall we say, moderate in their tone. Now, if the Social Democrats in Germany, recent winners of elections, form a coalition soon, then this is the last European Council summit for Angela Merkel, who's been in charge in Berlin for 16 years. On Poland, the German Chancellor employing all of her trademark caution.
Rule of law is a core aspect of the European Union. At the same time, we have to find ways of coming back together, because a cascade of cases at the European Court is not a solution.
So Daniel Freund, can you interpret that for us? Is that Angela Merkel saying, don't go for the nuclear option first, let's talk, let's negotiate? Or is that Angela Merkel saying, let's not have sanctions?
At least she was saying, and she has been saying it throughout the last few days, we shouldn't rush it. And I think, the situation in Hungary has been very clear now for 11 years that Orban has said he is building an illiberal democracy. Peace has been in power for 6 years, dismantling day in and day out the Polish judiciary, media independence, and so on. I think the time for discussion, in a way, is over. We shouldn't stop the dialogue. Obviously, we should always keep talking, but it is also time for concrete action. Because we have seen that just dialogue over the last few years has brought us to the current situation and has meant that Poland has now left the legal order. And
so for you, what does concrete action mean?
The European Commission has to react firmly to that.
Daniel, what does concrete action mean for you? What would you say concrete action is? The picture seems to have frozen there, unfortunately. We've lost the connection. We'll try to...
The concrete action means...
Go ahead, Daniel. We can hear you now.
Sorry, it seems the internet connection in the parliament a bit wobbly. First thing needs to be that the rule of law conditionality mechanism is triggered. Secondly, we need to continue withholding the Corona Recovery Fund. That cannot be paid out under the current circumstances. Third, we need to use the tool of infringement procedures. But basically, all three tools at the same time to ensure that the legal order is protected and that the interests of EU taxpayers are protected.
Dominika Kozic?
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have found just the last sentence of Angela Merkel from today, from doorstep during today's summit. She told exactly, I'm reading from Twitter, sorry for this, an avalanche of lawsuit of EU Court of Justice won't fix the problem with rule of law. Problem is, countries has different views on the meaning of the EU. Ever closer union, or more national states. Best place to talk it out would be the Conference on Future of Europe. It is what Angela Merkel told something like 3 hours ago. And honestly, yes, and it was surprising for many of journalists.
If you don't like it, well, then you have to change the treaty. But you can't just stop following a treaty because all of a sudden you don't like what it says in the preamble of the treaty, a treaty that was signed and ratified by Kaczynski 12 years ago.
Daniel Freund, let me ask you on this. Right now, of course, Angela Merkel is a lame duck chancellor. Olaf Schulz, we haven't heard from him directly. He's the heir apparent. He's trying to cobble together a coalition with your party, the Greens, most notably. Is Olaf Schulz going to be tougher on Poland and Hungary than Angela Merkel is?
I think so. All three parties in the coalition to be formed have been very vocal, including here in the European Parliament. People like Katarina Barley, former Justice Minister for the Social Democrats, very outspoken. We as Greens, the Liberals as well. So I'm quite confident that we will have a different line, a more ambitious protection of the rule of law and democracy in the European Union.
Franke Krummüller, is that an analysis you share?
I mean, I think a couple of things in terms of context that are interesting is, first of all, if the EU, the reason I think why this is extremely complicated and has been going on for some time is that, of course, the EU deciding to sanction one of its own member states is significant action. Maybe that's what it requires, but just to explain why that takes some time and why there is such heavy debate about it. And then I think
heard Daniel there saying trigger Article 7 right away, freeze the funding for the pandemic recovery fund for Poland.
Right. And I mean, as everybody has said, it has been going on for years and with several member states. But the hurdle is definitely to sanction one of your own or to take voting rights away from one of your own. I think the other thing that's interesting to take into account is what happens if Poland doesn't get these funds that it does need, like all member states need these funds after the pandemic. It will, it impacts what can be done, the recovery locally. It impacts what the government plans to do in terms of its own economic recovery program. So that will be very interesting, I think, to watch.
And Nathalie Loiseau, will that turn Polish citizens more against the European Union if they feel as the pinch from not getting that pandemic recovery fund?
Well, what we see in the polls is that Polish people are very much in favor of the European Union. 80% of Polish people are in favor. I think no one wants a Polexit in Poland. So now it's up to the Polish government to make its own decision. Indeed, that would be a disaster for Poland if Poland was deprived of recovery money. But this is their political choice with consequences attached.
And when you hear our German panelists here talking about a tougher line, would you say that the future of Europe rests in Berlin and who is in the next coalition government, or more in Brussels?
It rests in the hands of European citizens, and we are only representatives of European citizens. I regret that Angela Merkel, for her last summit, still sticks to the notion that talk is fine. We've been talking for years, and inaction has led us to this level of crisis, because none of what we are talking about, judiciary in Poland, disciplinary chamber, public affairs chamber, we have not mentioned it, but it's one more sign of politicization of the judiciary in Poland. Nothing is news to our ears. We knew it, we saw it coming, and if action was taken before, it would have been simpler. Now it's up to the Polish government to make its own decision, but they have to come with something. And unfortunately, Prime Minister Morawiecki, when he came to the European Parliament, came with no solution, no olive branch, nothing. He was talking to his militant base, and it was not giving a signal that he had heard the level of concerns that we will have.
Famke Krummüller, because those who are willing to give Angela Merkel the benefit of the doubt talk about the fact that you can't go in guns a-blazing on something like that's so significant, as you mentioned it yourself. Also saying it's her upbringing. She grew up in the former East Germany. She knows what a divided Europe looks like. She doesn't want to see Europe tear itself apart. What do you answer to that?
I mean, I think no surprise for anyone here that this is how she responds. It's been her classic style on how she manages these crises. She's never been in favor of confrontation. And actually, one of the other points that I wanted to make is actually zooming out and the fact that the EU keeps on having to deal with these infightings and the problems between member states, or the challenges of getting on the same page, obviously also impacts how the EU acts internationally. And I think in the broader context of the tensions that we can see between the US and China, that is a significant thing as well to consider.
We're laying our dirty laundry out in public? That's a problem for you. And by the way, there's another layer to this, and it's being talked about at this EU summit, which is problems at Europe's borders. While Berlin ponders what to do about rule of law, on Wednesday, Germany's conservative interior minister offered Poland joint patrols at their common border, what with Belarus, that's been waiving visa restrictions since the summer, and sending off incoming migrants on one-way trips to its borders with Lithuania, Latvia, and of course, Poland. Daniel Freund, can you have one conversation about rule of law without having the other conversation about what's a brewing migrant crisis, perhaps?
well, both conversations need to be had. What the situation on the Belarusian-Polish border shows is how easily we as Europeans, well, are split from the outside. How easily our unity is attacked, particularly in those policy areas where we need unanimity to take any decisions at all. But what we should be able to manage as 450 million Europeans is, on the one hand, obviously to protect our borders, to have a firm line with an autocratic government in Belarus, but also to respect our fundamental values, the right to seek asylum if you are persecuted, if you are threatened by war or by death in your country, that you have the right to seek shelter in the European Union. And we are big enough, we're strong enough, we're rich enough to offer shelter to those that need it.
But Daniel, let me ask you about this, because when you have these migrants that are crossing over from Belarus, it's not Poland where they want to stay. They want to come your way to Germany. And so when Angela Merkel calls for dialogue, for restraint with Poland, is it because, well, she doesn't want a migrant crisis and she wants to cooperate genuinely with the Poles on this?
Well, I mean, the European Parliament a long time ago already suggested that we should have a European solution to those that seek asylum in Europe, that there should be a fair share of burden and a distribution among EU states. It shouldn't be those that are the first on the route that are left alone. And it doesn't matter whether that country is Poland or Greece or Italy, but we should face this together as Europeans, and then we can come to good solutions for everyone.
Before we go, Nathalie Loiseau, there is a point made by the Polish Prime Minister that I want to bring up, which has been shared by a lot of people, which is this idea that in the EU, there's mission creep. At the beginning, it's a coal and steel partnership. It becomes a European project over time, and it becomes more and more of a political project. We're seeing it now at this summit. One concrete example, this talk of having pooling resources when it comes to buying natural gas. We saw it with vaccines. Is there, though, this moment where there is an overstretch, and a lot of EU citizens feel like the EU has taken on more and more prerogatives, and that it shouldn't?
I don't know if European citizens think that Europe should not take prerogatives, because if you talk about vaccines, the critics of the European Union was that the EU was too slow and not bold enough to be able to buy and produce vaccine together. So there was a strong push from the citizens that the European Union should do more. And it is not out of ideology, it's out of necessity. If we have this recovery package that we are talking about, it's because it was needed. And someone like Angela Merkel might not have favored a common debt in principle until the moment it became a necessity, just because we could not let some member states in disarray facing this crisis. So,
and once that necessity happens,
yes,
do you go back to the old system? That's the question. I mean, we may get a fiscal hawk as the next German finance minister, by the way.
We have principles, and that's very important. And then we face crises and we face realities. And every time the EU has been confronted to a crisis, it has made progress. And the world has changed around us. There are big powers. There is instability. There is uncertainty. We know that we have to face a very assertive China, that we have to face an aggressive Russia, and that we cannot remain divided. So it's more necessity than anything else that should bring us together. And I'm certain that every time we are divided, every time some governments still discuss and dispute the importance of going further in the European project, there are people in Beijing, in Moscow and elsewhere who applaud to these divisive speeches.
Dominika Kozic, you agree?
I would like just to go back to one sentence, topic, if you allow me. We are talking about energy prices, about energy security, but there is one example of European solidarity, lack of solidarity. It is Nord Stream 2. I'm sorry, but it is absolutely against European solidarity, and it is one of the reasons the close relation with Russia and Gazprom, why we have now much more higher prices of the energy, because Russia is using blackmailing. It's just blackmailing European Union, and it was very wrong decision of the German government to build this construction, Nord Stream 2, together with Russia. Russia is using this now against all European Union. And one other thing about Belarusian and migrants, most of the people who are now crossing a border with Poland from Belarusian side, illegal migrants, they are not looking for asylum in Poland because they have option to do it on the legal way, to ask for the asylum in Poland, but they prefer to cross borders illegally, and they are of course supporting, even pushing by a Belarusian regime to destabilize situation in Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Sorry to make to going back to this point, but I think that it's quite important to see how it is looking like. That Belarus is, there are many pictures, many proofs, like Belarusian soldiers are pushing these poor people, because they are poor, they need some help, to cross illegally border with Poland.
But for that, on that score, everyone agrees with you, Dominika, that's what's happening at the Belarusian border itself. The question is, what happens when they're stuck in that no man's land? Very briefly, Famke Krummeler, because we're out of time. This issue of mission creep and Europe becoming too federal.
I think it really depends on the issues, and I think there's also a certain level of incoherence in the discourses, certainly of certain politicians, but also in the mind of citizens, because it's all very complicated. But health, for example, is a good example. It's not a European competence, but everybody expected the EU to act better on it. And so that is something that I think would need to be addressed in the future. And I think one final word on the EU dealing with all of these internal tensions, the energy crisis is, or the crisis of the energy prices, is another good example of where that's something where
Vladimir Putin today has said that he can increase supplies of natural gas to Europe via the Nord Stream 2 pipeline once it gets approved.
That's, it highlights that the EU needs to deal with its external relationships, and that is a really important issue because, for example, these higher electricity prices really impact business. It impacts the citizens across the European Union, and I think that's something.
Consensus is needed.
Yes, like for so many things.
Famke Krummeler, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Nathalie Loiseau, Daniel Freund, and Dominika Kozic in Brussels. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.